Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great to be at this hearing. And it's great because it exposes two very different ways of thinking about our economy, opportunity, and the mutually shared goal of overcoming poverty. So on the one hand, you have a deep and persistent focus on inequality. It's defined as the gap between the rich and the poor. And at first glance, that seems pretty reasonable. But in reality, it means you're dividing your attention. Half your attention is focused on protesting the wealthy, and these days that seems actually where most of the attention is. And that leaves only a small amount of focus on the real issue, which is people in poverty and their ability to move up the economic ladder. And this is the kind of backwards thinking that leads to ideas like Andrew Yang's, where we raise taxes on the rich only to give it right back to them in the form of universal basic income. It's hard to imagine a more inefficient and ineffective way to reduce poverty. So as a conservative, our approach is different. Instead of creating resentment against success, we focus on who actually needs our help, which is the people who are having trouble moving up the economic ladder. After all, the fact that there's a much wealthier person down the street from you is not the problem. The problem occurs that if you can't find opportunities even when you make all the right decisions. So the first step to understanding any problem is to get to the truth. Mr. Ponuru, I want to go to you on this. We've heard inequality is worse than ever. Is that true, especially if we use a more accurate measure of inflation and account for welfare programs and cash transfers?
No, it does not appear to be true. The Congressional Budget Office's reports on the distribution of income suggest that income inequality peaked in 2007, that it has been falling since then. And so we are, I think, to some extent looking at a problem in the rearview mirror. Of course, that could change. Maybe next year's numbers will be different, but the trends over the last decade or so have been towards shrinking inequality.
And then let's talk about the people we really want to help, those in the bottom quintile of earners. So let's find out who they are. So can you break that apart demographically? I mean, who are the people in the bottom quintile? Maybe that helps us focus our problem setting here.
So people in the bottom quintile differ from people in the other quintiles across a variety of measures. One of the more important things to look at is the number of workers in the household. The top quintile is going to be much more likely to have 2 earners in that household, and the bottom quintile is much more likely to have 0 earners in the household. Obviously, that's going to make a huge difference in how much income you've got. There's also the question of age. If you're retired or if you're young and in school, you may very well be in the lowest quintile. Doesn't mean you are always going to be in that quintile or always were. Lifetime inequality is lower.
Right. So it's possible that we're placing a teenager who lives with their parents in the bottom quintile of earners and saying that, okay, that's one extra person in under the poverty line, right? Statistically speaking.
Right. Inequality seems to have increased however you measure it, but it is, I think, important to have that perspective.
Right. It also turns out that 56% of Americans will at some point in their lives be in the top 10% of earners. 73% of Americans will be in the top 20% of earners in their lifetime. It's an amazing statistic. Doesn't mean we can't always do better, but it's an amazing statistic. It also turns out my colleagues are right that the middle class is shrinking. It's just not in the way that they think. Turns out the data shows the middle class is shrinking because they're moving up into higher income households over time. This is all good news. Doesn't mean we can't improve. The point is that the rhetoric about inequality is not only inaccurate, but it's just flat out unhelpful to the people we're actually trying to help. So let's talk about solutions really quick. We want to empower people to rise up instead of disempowering them with more handouts. And how do we do that? You don't need to take my word for this. Okay, Mayor Bloomberg, okay, prominent Democrat, studied this extensively with 30 different pilot programs. And what they found is there's different solutions for different kinds of poverty, and they're localized solutions. We have to be thinking about it that way. So back to you, Doctor. How else can we empower people to rise up? You talk about occupational licensing. You know, I have a constituent in my district. Her name is Ashley. She owns a hair wash and style company. She can't find stylists because Texas requires 1,000 hours of licensing to wash and dry hair. Okay, I learned how to free fall out of an airplane at 30,000 feet in less time than that. That's crazy. Can you talk about more solutions like that? You mentioned housing. What kinds of deregulation? What kind of vocational training can we be working on so that we empower people to rise above their current economic status?
So I think with this little time I have here, What we should be doing is focusing specifically on mobility, opportunity, and fighting poverty, not as much on inequality per se, and identifying barriers often created by the government that we can get out of the way.